Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS legal hotline lawyer. And I want to talk to you today about an issue that the Department of Licensing is discovering over and over and over in its audits of your files. And that is that brokers in our state do not understand the concept of agency representation, or said better, brokers in our state do not understand who in the transaction the broker represents. Now, you might think I'm not talking to you because you think, of course I know who I represent, but I urge you to pay attention to this video because it is shocking the number of purchase and sale agreements the Department of Licensing is finding where agency is improperly disclosed by the brokers in the transaction. And I do not believe for 1 minute that there are that many brokers in this state who are intentionally deceiving their clients about their agency. I am confident it is a lack of knowledge. So here we go. It's pretty simple if you follow the agency law path laid out for you. The agency law covers this at RCW 18.86.020. Here's what the agency law says. I'm going to summarize it for you. Every broker in every single transaction, start over. Every broker in every single transaction represents the buyer. Okay, that's our first premise. Your default is always that you represent the buyer. If you're a broker in a transaction, you represent the buyer. Unless, let's make that a capital UNLESS, unless you have a written agency agreement with the seller. If you have a written agency agreement with the seller, we typically refer to that as a listing agreement. If you have a listing agreement, then you represent the seller exclusively. So let's say that differently. If you have a listing agreement, you do not represent the buyer. Period. End of story. Put those two together. In a transaction, you, the real estate broker, you represent the buyer. Unless you have a listing agreement, in which case you represent the seller. Here's the next unless. This is the last unless, but understand this one. Again, capital UNLESS. Unless you also have a written agency agreement with the buyer. And if you have a written agency agreement with the seller and a written agency agreement with the buyer, then and only then are you a dual agent. And if you have a written agency agreement with the seller and a written agency agreement with the buyer, you cannot avoid being a dual agent. You are necessarily a dual agent. You must accurately disclose your agency representation on the purchase and sale agreement. You should not disclose that you represent both parties unless you have a written agency agreement with the buyer. I'm assuming that if you disclose you represent both parties, you have a listing agreement. But what too many brokers do is, because they're the listing broker and because they wrote the offer for the buyer, they assume they're a dual agent. But based on the Washington agency law, you are not a dual agent unless you have a written buyer agency agreement. I can't overemphasize this. Brokers are routinely misrepresenting their agency. And this is set forth in the context of this DOL Disciplinary Trends video series because the DOL is picking it up, but really the DOL may not be your biggest concern. If you're misrepresenting your agency to your client or clients, and there's a post-closing problem that results in a lawsuit, what do you think is going to be the very first identification of a claim against you set forth by your client's lawyer? It's going to be that you led your client to believe you were their agent when in fact you weren't, or you were your client's agent, but you wrongfully gave agency duties to the other party when you really weren't their agent. You've got to understand the basics of who you represent and how you create that agency relationship. You need to review these principles. Designated brokers, I can't encourage you enough to discuss these issues in your office meetings frequently. It seems that brokers hear this information today but might forget it a few days from now. So understand and reteach the principles of who brokers represent and the importance of accurately disclosing that agency relationship. Please send questions to me if you have them on this issue. It's really critical that as an association, all of you, our members, understand this issue. Send email questions to me at legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.